OK. So a deficiency that I think we fixed in this course since about a year or so ago is because of the availability of Jasmine, a really nice tool for doing TDD in JavaScript. It turns out that it's from our friends at Pivotal Labs, has made it possible for us to give the same kind of treatment for TDD in JavaScript as we've been giving to the server side written in Ruby and using Rails. So Jasmine is a really nice framework that was really built to resemble RSpec, right? It was built by the guys at Pivotal who are, they're already a Ruby shop. They use RSpec a lot. They really believe in TDD. So they wanted a tool that was sort of as pleasant to use for JavaScript as RSpec is for Ruby. Now, of course, if you're testing JavaScript, the idea is you might as well run your tests in the browser, right? Because that's where the JavaScript interpreter is. So there's a gem that you install, and there's an add-on that we recommend, both of which are installed in the course VM, that give you some nice testing abilities. We're going to show some examples. You run a generator that puts a few files in place. Just like when you generate RSpec install, it puts some specs in the right place. Jasmine install will create a directory for your JavaScript specs. And then you basically start a little Jasmine server. You run a server runs on a dedicated port on localhost. And what it serves is the Jasmine test page. Right? So what's happening is it's a page where your JavaScript code and the tests that go with it are running. Right? They need an environment in which to run. That environment, in the case of our apps, is a browser. So that's what Jasmine fires up for you. So let's just assume, because this turns out to be the case, that once again, you already know all the concepts necessary to do TDD in JavaScript. In fact, I would say you know all the concepts to do TDD in any language. But because Jasmine was deliberately built to resemble RSpec, the transition is even easier, in my opinion. So the only two things we have to figure out are how do we write the tests, and how do tests see the page on which they normally operate? Because a big difference between the server side and the client side is if we're writing client-side JavaScript, usually it expects to run in the presence of an HTML page with elements on it. So given that we're setting up this little separate server where our tests run, how do our tests get it so that the JavaScript being tested behaves as it would in the environment in which we operate it? And hopefully some of you are already thinking, well, isn't that kind of like the reason that you use things like mocks and stubs and fixtures in RSpec? And it is, and that turns out to be the answer. So Jasmine is a lot like RSpec. In RSpec, we can group sets of related examples with describe. And each example is an it block, which is basically a descriptive string, and a do block. And what's a do block? It's an anonymous lambda, right? We went through all this when we talked about Ruby. The JavaScript version in Jasmine looks exactly the same thing. Describe takes two arguments. The first one is a descriptive string of what is being described, the group of tests. The second one is a closure, an anonymous lambda. And the contents of that anonymous lambda are one or more individual clauses, individual tests, examples, specs. And again, just like RSpec, each one consists of a descriptive string and a function that runs the actual test. So the structure is exactly the same as the RSpec structure. The only difference is the syntax in Ruby versus JavaScript for how you specify a closure. Test setup and teardown. In RSpec, we could say before each and provide a block. In Jasmine, we could say before each, and we provide a function, which is the equivalent. Right? An anonymous function is just like a block, but in JavaScript. There's expectations. In RSpec, we can say expect the result of some expression to equal something or to not equal something. Same thing in Jasmine. Expect some expression to equal foo, to be truthy or falsy. And this is not the truthy or falsy from the Comedy Network. This is truthy and falsy are real concepts in JavaScript. Falsy are 0, the empty string, undefined, null, a handful of other things. So be aware of the subtle difference. Remember that in Ruby, only nil and false are really false. Everything else is true. JavaScript's a little more subtle. But the idea of truthiness and falsiness are expectations. You can also have expectations that you test on elements in the DOM. This is where the Jasmine jQuery extension comes in. That gives you additional expectations like to be hidden. An element shouldn't be visible to the user. To have class, not in the sense of being a redneck, but in the sense of having a CSS class which you name. To contain some text or not contain it. Here's a partial list of some of the other expectations, but the Jasmine jQuery documentation lists them all. But pretty much all the ones that you'd be finding useful if you were writing JavaScript code that modifies the DOM. You'd want to check whether specific controls are selected or checked, whether controls are enabled or disabled, visible or not visible. So here's, again, a simple example of putting it together. How would we test that when a particular button is clicked in the user interface, it results in hiding the thing that it's supposed to hide, right? Kind of like the example that I showed before when we had a checkbox and it would alternately show and hide some associated content. Well, here's a describe block. Technically, we didn't need a describe block this time because there's only one test case, but just so you see the syntax. And here's our single spec. It hides the movie div, and here's the function that does the test. It looks for the link that is supposed to trigger the action. It calls trigger, which will basically behave as if the user had done this kind of event. So this is actually testing a couple of things, right? Suppose that we had a bug in our setup function where even though the function that does the hiding worked, our setup function didn't correctly bind the handler that we wanted. This test would uncover that bug because this is going to cause the same sequence of events to happen as if the user had generated the click action themselves. So this is like the equivalent of having a bad route, right? If you try to do an RSpec test to test a controller action, and it turns out that you didn't correctly specify the route for that action, that same test would expose it. So kind of the same idea here. And once we've triggered the click action, if we believe that the result of that is that it should cause a certain element to be hidden, we could say expect that element to be hidden. So the only thing we did here is we did the same behavior as the user would have done clicking a button, and we're checking that the behavior has the desired effect in the DOM, all using jQuery secret powers. This would be massively more painful using the raw JS API. So based on just what you know about JavaScript, you should be able to answer this question. Which things are always true about the it method in Jasmine, which is built to mimic the it method of RSpec? It can take a named function as its second argument. And I'll show you again the example so that you don't have to worry about which one is the second argument. It can take an anonymous function as its second argument. And it executes asynchronously. So once again, here's the simple example that we had. Here is the it clause. Here is the second argument, which is the thing that you're testing. And we're asking, it can take a named function. It can take an anonymous function. And the overall test case executes asynchronously. So which subset of those statements are true?